I'm Bruce Jentleson, professor at Duke University, Sanford School of Public Policy and Political Science Department, and co-director of the Bridging the Gap program, which is sponsor of our session today. And the first thing I want to do is welcome everybody, hoping all are healthy and safe and adapting, you and your families, your friends, your colleagues. And it's great that you can have time to join us for what will be a very interesting and dynamic discussion. Before I get into the event, let me just say a word about the Bridging the Gap program. Many of you know our programs, you've participated in them, but for those that don't, we've been running these programs for about 15 years now. And as the title reflects, Bridging the Gap, our goal really has been to, find opportunities to connect the academic and the policy worlds in the area of foreign policy, international relations. We run programs for PhD students, for faculty, some directly interacting with policymakers, dealing with American foreign policy, but dealing also more broadly with the global agenda, with the role of NGOs and a whole variety of issues. And we've had support really over the years from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the last couple of years also from another foundation, the Frankel Foundation. And my colleagues, you can go to our website. My colleague Catherine Urban will put the link up in the chat box if there's anything else you'd like to know about it, or feel free to get in touch with us afterwards. One of our programs is really for about the last 3-4 years, we've started a book series with Oxford University Press called the Bridging the Gap book series. And it's really for books principally that are scholarly, but that genuinely address policy issues. Not a bullet pointed, if you do this, the world will be great. But also not 250 pages in like 3 paragraphs. And we have 5, the book we're talking about today is the 5th in our series. We have 6 others under contract. We feel like the series has been valuable to people both as they build their academic careers and for this kind of interchange. So today's event is on the book we recently published, Delta Democracy, Pathways to Incremental Civic Revolution in Egypt and Beyond, by Professor Catherine Herrold, who I will introduce more in a second. But let me mention 2 things before we move into the intros of our panel. One is we are recording this event and it'll be posted on our website later this week. And my colleague Catherine will explain how we'll do quick Q&A in a minute. But I'd also like to draw your attention to an event that we have upcoming on July 21st, titled Rethinking How We Teach International Relations. This is really picking up on the dialogue that's been developing on Twitter, and publications like Foreign Policy, and a variety of other ways on how we think about race in our teaching international relations, how we think about issues like pandemics and the like. And we put together a really great panel. My colleague and Bridging the Gap co-director Jim Goldgeier is going to chair it. I think you're going to get the Eventbrite invitation as well there as well. So I encourage you to think about that. Something we're all, particularly as we think about our courses for the fall, are thinking a lot about. So our panelists, Professor Catherine Harrell. Catherine is assistant professor at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, a faculty affiliate at Indiana's Paul O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. She's been a visiting scholar at American University in Cairo, at Birzeit University in Palestine. And her work, this book in particular, deals with how NGOs and philanthropies and grassroots groups work to promote change in the Middle East. This draws on her fieldwork in Egypt. She's also done fieldwork in Jordan, Syria, Palestine, and Qatar. The book, as I said, is entitled Delta Democracy, Pathways to Incremental Civic Revolution in Egypt and Beyond. Her PhD, I'm proud to say, is from Duke University, and she was a participant in our 2019 Bridging the Gap International Policy Summer Institute. Stephen Cook is joining us as one of the panelists and commentators. He's the E&I Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and African Studies, the Council on Foreign Relations, and also Director of their International Affairs Fellowships for Tenured International Relations Scholars. Many people know Stephen for his work. He's an expert on Arab and Turkish politics, as well as US policy in the Middle East. There's a number of books to his credit: False Dawn, Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East, The Struggle for Egypt from Nasser to Tahrir Square, and has been affiliated with a number of think tanks in Washington, and also writes a regular column for Foreign Policy magazine. His PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania. Amy Hawthorne is a Middle East expert who also has extensive policy, analytic, and practical experience in Arab political reform and democracy promotion. She's with the Project on Middle East Democracy, POMED in its acronym name. And she's also served in a number of other capacities at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East, where one of her focuses was U.S. policy towards Egypt. She served in the State Department. She was the founding executive director of the Holling Center for International Dialogue. Has been with the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace and a number of other areas. She graduated with honors from Yale, with a focus on the Middle East, and has her MA from the University of Michigan. And I want to welcome friends and colleagues in the audience, including a number of Duke colleagues who served on Professor Herrold's dissertation committee and other roles. And particular thanks to Catherine Urban, who's our Bridging the Gap program specialist, for setting this up. So Catherine, do you want to take a second and explain how we're going to do the Q&A and the discussion?
Sure, Bruce, thanks. So we will be having a Q&A discussion at the end of the session, but you can go ahead and feel free to submit questions at any point, either through the chat function or through the Q&A. And please also know that if you would prefer that your name not be mentioned in your question, please do make a note of that.
Otherwise, we will mention your name so our panelists know, who the question is from in the spirit of dialogue. So we've asked each panelist to speak for about 15 minutes. We're going to start with the author, Professor Harrell, and then move on to Stephen Cook and then Amy Hawthorne, and then we'll have plenty of time to come to questions that folks have. So, Katie, over to you.
Thank you, Bruce. It's an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to launch my book under the auspices of the Bridging the Gap series at Oxford University Press. I'd like to begin with a few words of thanks. First, as Bruce mentioned, the research for this book began as a PhD project at Duke University, where I received patient and very wise mentorship from faculty in Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy, the departments of political science, economics, and Asian and Middle Eastern studies, and also the sociology department at the University of North Carolina. Second, the three editors of the Bridging the Gap series, Jim Goldgeier, Bruce Jentleson, and Steve Weber, deserve special mention. They championed this book from the very start. They coached me through the reviews, and along with the Bridging the Gap program coordinators, including Layla Adler, Christina Biad, and Catherine Urban, they've worked tirelessly to ensure that this book reaches the policymaking community. And third, two anonymous reviewers provided concrete, detailed feedback on the manuscript's first draft, and they helped me to strengthen the book's argument and fine-tune the policy recommendations. So thank you, Reviewer 1 and Reviewer 2. Let me, of course, stress that the mistakes that do appear in the manuscript are my own. And thank you especially to Bruce Jentleson for moderating today's discussion, and to Amy Hawthorne and Stephen Cook for serving as discussants. They have extensive insights into the back channels of the design and the implementation of US democracy assistance, and I hope that their feedback will spark a robust conversation and debate about the possibilities for strengthening US democracy promotion. So I'll now provide an overview of the book's argument and the policy recommendations, and then I look forward to that conversation and that debate. So the January 25th, 2011 Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt that toppled longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak seemed to present a major political opportunity for Egyptian non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, to break free from decades of repression and lead civil society's democracy promotion efforts. Now, two groups of NGOs, local human rights organizations and international democracy promotion NGOs that were operating in Egypt, responded very rapidly. Their projects related to electoral, legislative, judicial reform, human rights protection, transitional justice, and independent media, for example, place these organizations really at the front lines of civil society's democracy building work. The United States and other Western donors also responded quickly, increasing budgets and launching new funding programs related to democracy and good governance. But those human rights NGOs and the international NGOs constitute only a small sliver of Egypt's vast NGO sector that includes around 40,000 organizations. And a much larger segment of that sector, including development NGOs and their local philanthropic foundation donors, voiced support for democratic political reform after Mubarak's fall, but they appeared to hang back and they failed to fundamentally alter their programs and their grant-making strategies. Instead, they remained squarely focused in the realm of socioeconomic development. So what was already a bifurcated NGO sector prior to the 2011 uprisings became even more starkly divided afterwards. In one group were those human rights organizations and international NGOs who centered their efforts on democracy and good governance and received the bulk of the West's democracy aid. And then that second, much larger group of development and NGOs, also charitable organizations, local philanthropic foundations, these organizations dwelled in the realm of socioeconomic development. And while they did receive grants earmarked for development and humanitarian relief, they were largely ineligible for the potentially lucrative new funds coming in for democracy promotion. And they appeared to squander what was an unprecedented opportunity to advance democratic political reform in Egypt. But in Delta Democracy, I argue that those development NGOs and their local foundation donors did promote democracy after the fall of Mubarak. And they did so at least through 2017, which was my last visit to the field. They did so deliberately and in ways that were culturally resonant and politically smart. While the specific responses varied by organization, they displayed two key characteristics across organizations. First, NGOs integrated democracy promotion work into and masked it behind socioeconomic development projects. They never publicly referred to their work as quote unquote democracy promotion. But in quiet conversations, they emphasized that their efforts were very much aimed at bringing about democratic political reform. And second, organizations adopted a participatory approach aimed at cultivating norms, habits, and expectations of democratic citizens at local levels. And this participatory approach centered on three types of practices. First, discussion, debate, and collective problem solving, in which organizations created space for and actively encouraged beneficiaries and community members to discuss local challenges, to debate priorities, and to work collectively to implement some solutions. So imagine, for example, a grassroots NGO that long served as a hub of community convenings, and that after the uprisings continued its development work and continued to serve as a hub of convenings, but was also transformed into a site of mobilization and activism, both locally and in Cairo's Tahrir Square, where protests continued. Second, free expression, in which organizations created the space for all kinds of free expression, often through arts and culture. This included hosting arts festivals, theater performances, even art classes in which citizens came together and could express both their personal beliefs and their visions for the future of Egypt. So the idea underlying these programs was that all citizens had the freedom and the right to express and debate visions for the future of their communities and for Egypt as a nation. And third, rights claiming, in which organization leaders really coached beneficiaries on their rights as democratic citizens, and in some cases urged them to act collectively to claim those rights from local government officials. And these types of rights stressed things that we often take for granted in more democratic contexts: quality healthcare, basic community infrastructure, the right to education and employment opportunities, etc. So imagine women coming together in a library in a village created by a literacy NGO, where they lingered not just to borrow books, but also to hatch plans to call on local government officials to improve basic community infrastructure. So for example, to address a rat infestation in the village, to construct a crosswalk by the local school, a shelter at the bus stop, etc. And across all of these activities was the idea that all Egyptians had the rights and responsibilities as democratic citizens and that they possessed collective agency. And this participatory approach had at least two key benefits. First, it respected the intertwined nature of politics and economics in Egypt, because we know with the benefit of hindsight, and in fact, many knew at the time, that the 2011 protests weren't aimed at bringing about the procedures of US liberal democracy to Egypt, but rather at the values of political freedom, economic justice, and social solidarity. The approach also helped these organizations to evade government repression. By late 2011, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which was the transitional government at the time, launched a vicious campaign against Egypt's NGO sector, and the government's assault was intensified by Presidents Morsi and Sisi. Now, of course, national institutions do matter. And the Mubarak regime was notorious for calling for economic reform before democracy. In fact, many human rights organizations accused development NGOs of perpetuating that trope. For their part, the leaders of development NGOs stressed that their efforts were necessary but not sufficient. They absolutely believed that the country needed representative legislatures, independent judiciaries, free and fair elections, and the like. But their assessment of the unpredictable political context and the economic decline led NGO leaders to believe that they could be most effective by weaving together economic development and political reform at local levels. And with hindsight, they were prescient. Successive governments' attacks on Egypt's NGO sector forced many international NGOs out of Egypt, shuttered a number of human rights organizations, and led some leaders of remaining groups to, quote, pack prison bags, unquote, for when they would be hauled off to jail. Meanwhile, development NGOs continued to promote reform below the radar. So what does this mean for US democracy assistance? First, let me review briefly the prevailing critiques of current democracy promotion strategies. US democracy aid in particular has been fairly widely criticized for failing to bring about meaningful democratic political reforms in the Middle East, despite millions of dollars that flow to the region every year. And the critiques tend to fall into three main categories. First, democracy aid's strong focus on procedural democracy. That is, it seeks to reform national political institutions and also, and typically fails to address head-on issues of socioeconomic inequality. Second, it circulates among an elite milieu of international NGOs and human rights NGOs that have highly trained staff, and it adopts a technical approach that tends to generate information and other tangible, quantitatively measured outputs. So recipients of democracy assistance conduct workshops and trainings. They host seminars, they publish reports, they prosecute legal cases, they monitor elections and other such activities, all of which can be important in their own right, but tend to be rather tame in that they fail to mobilize widespread populations in political opposition. And third, democracy aid's overtly political approach makes it quite dangerous for local organizations to accept. For one thing, it tags grantees as being tied to Western agendas, but more ominously, it draws government scrutiny. So many organizations are faced with a dilemma. Do they undertake the risk or forego lucrative democracy and good governance grants? Many local human rights organizations especially rely so heavily on Western support and Western democracy aid that they really don't have much of a choice. So based on the lessons learned from the Egyptian case, how can the US think about addressing some of these critiques and reforming US democracy assistance in ways more relevant and perhaps more safe, but also more effective on the ground. And the book lays out 4 primary recommendations that I hope we can discuss and debate today. First, de-silo grant making. Second, seek out new types of grantees. Third, reform application and evaluation procedures. And fourth, drive national values, not just institutions. So I'll run through these briefly and then look to our discussants for their input. So first, de-silo grant making. Grant makers tend to be siloed institutions. They have narrowly defined areas of focus such as education, arts and culture, healthcare, democracy, governance, etc. And these program areas are cordoned off into distinct program areas with specific program officers. But we know that transformative change happens not within neatly packaged sectors, but through efforts of interconnected groups and organizations that transcend boundaries. And moreover, maintaining that program area for democracy and good governance not only disregards the marriage between economic and political issues, but as I mentioned, it's also quite dangerous for organizations to accept. Aid organizations can consider streamlining program areas without abandoning their commitment to funding democratic political reform. Grant making structured around broader themes and values with political reform goals and political thinking underlying all of these programs and projects might prove more relevant. So for example, we might think about program areas such as leveraging local resources to support initiatives developed through community-led collaborations, community development and human dignity to support all facets of human rights, information and expression to support all forms of free expression and access to information. And a more integrated approach to grant making could, the book argues, be implemented comprehensively across geographic space and, importantly, outside of capital cities. So second, seek out new types of grantees. Currently, as I mentioned, most democracy aid flows to international NGOs and local human rights organizations. Yet many NGOs that are tagged as working solely in socioeconomic development may in fact be trying to incubate democratic cultures and nurture democratic citizens. So aid agencies could look, for example, to development NGOs, to social enterprises, to voluntary grassroots organizations as potential players in the democracy building arena. And since many of these groups are small and don't require significant funds, aid agencies could work with local donors and community philanthropy groups as potential partners in supporting hyper-local groups. Third, reform application and evaluation procedures. One of the most common critiques of democracy aid is that the bureaucracy and the monitoring that accompany aid depoliticize the work that's carried out by grant recipients. Grant applications are structured like business plans, and reporting schemes require organizations to describe progress toward measurable goals using quantitative metrics that are often better at measuring outputs, trainings conducted, press releases issued, reports published, etc., than the outcomes, fundamental democratic political reform. So donors could begin by reassessing grant application systems and working with local NGOs to craft applications that are accessible, particularly to grassroots groups, but still useful for the donors themselves. And as part of any evaluation process, donors and grantees can try to work more as co-learners, engaging in real honest conversations about what seems to work and what doesn't, and developing creative metrics that are true to the goal at hand. Finally, driving national values, not just institutions. Without responsible, accountable, and honest government institutions, democratic governance is impossible, and civil society will fail to reach its potential. So we do need, or target states do need democratic institutions, but rather than focusing on exporting the institutions of Western liberal democracy abroad, can aid agencies instead focus on pressuring target states to reform their institutions in ways that respond to citizens' demands for the values of freedom, justice, equality, and human dignity? And can aid conditionality be be deployed more honestly, for example, by withholding aid or particularly future aid, when target governments fail to curb human rights violations. So in conclusion, the Arab Spring protests reflected a wider global set of civic revolutions seeking not just to overthrow dictators, but to more fundamentally build more sovereign and just societies. Citizens around the world, including here in the United States, are radically questioning old social orders. From the color revolution to Gezi Park, Idle No More, Occupy Wall Street, the Umbrella Movement, Black Lives Matter, the list goes on. Citizens are calling with common voice across ideological, socioeconomic, political, and national divides for shared values of freedom, justice, and equality. And the US has a potentially important role to play in backing these movements. And I hope that the ideas for the reform of US democracy assistance that I put forward today and in the book might spark a conversation about how the US can restructure its programs to better align with contemporary movements for democracy. So I very much welcome Amy and Stephen's feedback and critique, as well as comments and questions from those of you in the audience. For while this book is published, it's feedback from all of you that not only helps me to advance my thinking, but far more importantly, helps us to make progress in what I think is a shared goal in building more just, democratic, and equitable societies. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was really effective and powerful. And it's always hard with one's book to keep concise. You did a great job. And the spirit of what you're saying here at the end, you know, the openness to feedback. And I know from our conversations, you really are. The goal is less for everybody to like the book than to learn from it and for you to keep learning. So
yes.
With that in mind, let me pass the baton to Stephen Cook for his comments.
Great, thank you so much. First, before I get into it, I just want to say a couple of words of thanks to Bruce and to his co-collaborator in Bridging the Gap, Jim Goldgeier, for the very kind invitation and the opportunity to comment on Katie's book. It's also wonderful to be here with my old pal, Amy Hawthorne. I want to point out that I am using my favorite mug, the POMED mug. And to Katie, I've got tea in it because all you need is tea. It's great. It's great to be with Amy. And for me, it's a terrific thrill to be here to comment on Delta Democracy. I think it's a super interesting work. I was taken with it from almost the beginning, and that's where I want to start with the beginning. And what I'll do is I'll point out in the book the things that I thought were interesting and provided new pathways for research. I'll talk a little bit about foreign policy, but in a very broad way. Amy knows the ins and outs of this more than I could ever, Amy having served in the government and worked specifically on these programs. But I have some broader questions. But let me start out with the overall argument. And I was drawn to it because Katie's observations and the new facts, actually, that she unearthed during her long period of research really does, to my mind, open up new pathways to thinking about, one, the role of civil society, and two, how the United States should approach this question of not just democracy promotion, but how it relates to civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations. And I'll point out just a few of those. The first is, and which was surprising, call it a new fact, call it whatever, is the behavior of development-related foundations and NGOs. They actually have a greater capacity to mobilize citizens in pursuit of a democracy agenda than I think anybody working in this area previously believed. Now, I will cop to the fact that I am a tremendous skeptic. My graduate school training came during this kind of, overemphasis on the role of civil society as a causal factor in changes in society, and this was a huge research agenda. And I read a ton of this stuff, and then I read Antonio Gramsci, and I understood really what civil society was. And I think Katie gets at that a bit, but then she kind of smashes both of these two images. One, the kind of Tocquevillian view of civil society, forging change for better in the society, or the Gramscian view of civil society and non-governmental organizations as being kind of outer perimeters of regime defense, and shows that actually they don't conform to either of those ideas, and that they actually do things in a different kind of way, and that may in fact be a more effective way. And let me get into that right now. What Katie, I think, highlights is how development NGOs and foundations actually pursue a democracy agenda in a subtle and nuanced way that may, over a longer period of time, be more effective than those that are aligned with Western international organizations, and that may be more effective than the notions that we have about democracy promotion and the role of NGOs. That's to say that the democracy agenda can effectively be placed or nestled within a development agenda. And that's something that I don't think anybody's really brought out before in a systematic way to demonstrate. And I'll tell you, it's close to my heart, because I remember I was doing research on Egyptian history for a book, and I came across some of the administrative reforms that the British had undertaken in the late 19th, early 20th centuries that had a profound impact on agriculture and people engaged in agriculture, and that how it increased opportunities for people working in the field of agriculture, and that over a period of time it created a small technocratic class that had been and became the leading edge of nationalist agitation in Egypt. I think it's a really important thing to understand that a democracy agenda doesn't have to be a democracy agenda. Of course, I wrote something about this and was roundly criticized in Washington for it, betraying that some people don't know their history or appreciate unintended consequences. Anyway, that's an entirely separate story. It's a scar that I carry. But it's one that I think it's an important point. And speaking of the scar, I suspect, Katie, as you continue to promote this book, you're going to come up against people who are going to want to argue with these, with your kind of new pathways and new understandings of NGOs and the roles of NGOs, and the fact that a democracy agenda doesn't have to be a democracy agenda. Third point, the expectation that development foundations and NGOs would embrace a democracy agenda after the uprisings, and they would embrace them in alignment with international organizations, was unfounded. I think it's something that people expected. I think it was very shrewd politically of these NGOs to do. But I think the more important point, and one that you highlight, is that while autocrats can be adaptable, and we've seen how adaptable autocrats have been, NGOs and foundations are also quite adaptable. And that's to say that being co-opted or being perceived to be co-opted is not necessarily a death knell for the democracy agenda. This is quite a radical argument. The idea, and something that you discovered and highlighted in your research about how these people were working, weren't making a big deal of it, but were integrating the values of democracy, creating a democratic culture. I know we're not really supposed to talk about culture or democratic cultures, but creating a democratic culture, I think is very important. So anyway, taken together, I think it provides an interesting new analytic frame for us to understand how democracy promotion works and how Egyptians pursue democracy promotion, which is different from the way in which we perceive it and the way in which international organizations perceive it. And I tell you, when I was handed the book and I was told it was about civil society NGOs, I had some trepidation about it. because I've read so much about it that I was expecting my eyes to glass over, but it's really a refreshing, a very refreshing book. And it makes, I think, a very refreshing argument on the policy stuff. And I'll just make 2 points. First of all, kudos to you for getting into USAID. I have spent the better part of like 10 years trying to talk to people at USAID. In Washington, they say, sure, we'll talk to you, and then they ghost you. And then Amy actually set up a meeting for me at USAID with like a big wig at USAID in Cairo. Before I went, it was all set, and then I got to Cairo, and the guy's like, yeah, sorry, I'm not going to. So I've actually had more contact with the Intel community in Washington, D.C. than I ever had with USAID. So how you manage to get there and get in the door, that in and of itself is a tremendous feat on your part. Your policy recommendations here all seem, reasonable to me. De-siloing, working at these different levels, and so on and so forth. I thought that was all, quite reasonable. But here's my question, and here's actually my primary critique of the manuscript. Delta democracy is, as I've said, is rich with new insights and thick with descriptions of development NGOs and foundations that are creative, they're close to the ground, they're in tune culturally with the people they serve, and they're politically savvy. All of those things are extraordinarily clear throughout the manuscript. It seems to me that they're actually pretty good at what they do. Now, you make a big point that, the kind of measurements and outputs that are required from grant recipients from either Western governments or Western organizations is not part of the thing. But it seems that they're very good at what they do. At the very least, they're very good at doing what they're doing, pursuing a democracy agenda without actually trumpeting the fact that they're pursuing a democracy agenda, which allows them to continue this work. So here's my question. And this is what's missing from the manuscript. Under these circumstances, and I don't want Amy to get mad at me, this is an intellectual question. Under these circumstances, why does the United States need a democracy promotion agenda? Whether in its current form or in some other form. I'm not saying it doesn't, but when you get to the point where you start talking about policy, you don't offer the rationale for it. It's just assumed that we should have a democracy promotion agenda. Is your point that we should have a democracy promotion agenda because we're the United States of America and we're a democracy, and this is something that animates our foreign policy? Or are you trying to say in the cost-benefit analysis that American policymakers go through when they are trying to figure out what's best for achieving U.S. interests in the world, a democracy promotion policy is a benefit to our achieving our interests, however they're defined? But I'm left with, we're talking about bridging the gap here. This incredible, long-term field research that has brought out really very interesting insights. Now the connection is, where do we go? I think we can all probably agree that democracy promotion programs always need, to be kind of tweaked and tuned and so on and so forth. But the real question is, do we need to do it? And what are the costs of doing it? Okay, I will end there. I'm looking forward to hearing Amy's views of the book. And Katie, of course, I'm looking forward to hearing your responses. Thanks so much.
Great, Stephen. Thank you. It was really important contributions and some things for us to carry through the rest of the conversation. Amy, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to also thank Bridging the Gap for inviting us to speak here today. Bridging the Gap is a really excellent initiative, and I'm honored to be participating in this event today. And I also want to congratulate Katie on this book, which is very impressive. It's very well written. And I don't say that lightly as someone who spends most of her days either writing or editing other people's writing. The writing skill in this book is truly impressive, and it creates a very engaging and enjoyable read. I really, really enjoyed reading this book. I found myself turning the pages, and I think, you know, with interest. And I think that you tell the story in a very effective way, and in many ways it's quite masterful how you weave in sort of the theoretical theory with practice. So congratulations on that. This book, I think, is part of a body of literature that is very important, that I think we need much more of. But to me, that body of literature falls under the rubric of, you know, what does democratic change look like in authoritarian countries? And what is the role of external actors in spurring or hindering or influencing that change? So I think that your book is a slice, it provides a slice, a look into that larger question, which is, I think, an extremely important question, not just for Egypt, but for, you know, societies around the world. And I do very much agree with you that US government democracy aid badly needs a rethink in the Middle East and North Africa. So with that in mind, let me offer some pieces of feedback on some of the points that you made. I really could speak for a very long time because there's so much to comment on your book, but I'll try to keep it short. First of all, I found your description of US democracy aid a bit narrow, or maybe a bit caricatured in some parts. I think that the US does fund and has funded in Egypt and other countries, and is funding now elsewhere around the world, a lot of the sort of national level democracy programs that you described. But democracy aid in the three or so decades that it's been around, US democracy aid has really evolved far beyond sort of its initial, I would say, narrow focus on those sort of procedures of democracy. I think that there has been learning in the US democracy promotion world, and that in some countries, particularly ones where the environment is much more permissible and hospitable than Egypt for US democracy aid, we have seen many more programs, even similar to the ones that you described, that Egyptian NGOs are carrying out with support from Egyptian foundations. So I thought that your what you were sort of arguing against maybe lacked enough sort of nuance and depth. And I would also point out that, in fact, in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and in Egypt prior to the 2011 uprising, the US government, among other donors, but including the US government, was in fact funding NGOs carrying out socioeconomic development work where there was no explicit description of those programs as being aimed to support gradual democratic development from the bottom up. But that is what those programs were trying to do. Now, whether they were effective, how well they did it, how badly they failed are certainly questions that are worthy of discussion. But I think your book doesn't go far enough back into the history of US democracy aid in Egypt and in other countries to know that for many years, a lot of the work that the US government funded in Egypt and elsewhere actually was this sort of what was often at the time kind of called like apolitical programming. But the goal behind the programming was to fund sort of NGOs working on socioeconomic development at the local level, was in fact to spur and promote the kind of gradual democracy from below that you described. But for various reasons, those programs were not always explicitly described as such. Jordan is an example where there's been quite a bit of programming in this vein that has taken place. I think that perhaps there's some parts of your study where you possibly idealized the Egyptian NGOs a little bit. I think it's certainly fair to say, and your critique that some of the organizations that the US has funded in Egypt and some of the things that the US has done in Egypt in terms of its democracy aid really have been out of step with local demands and have felt a bit foreign or haven't really connected with the culture on the ground, if we could use the word culture. And I take your point that the organizations that you studied may have much better and stronger grassroots connections, but there's sort of an underlying assumption that you make that these groups are representative, locally connected, have a certain kind of influence that they may or may not have. I don't think we should necessarily assume that. Some of these organizations may be very locally rooted and very representative, the Egyptian organizations, and others may be not. The reader doesn't know enough about them to be able to judge that. So it seems like you sort of presented that as a given. So I think the idea that because these are Egyptian NGOs and they work at a certain level, they are necessarily more effective, I think is something that should be, questioned. The third point has to do with impact. I feel like one of the main questions that was underlying your book, which is a really, really important question, is, if the US, for example, or any donor says that it's wanting to support democratic change and democratic development, and inculcate democratic values at the local level, what is the most effective way to do that? And I think the conclusion that your book draws, the main point that you make, is that these organizations are more effective at doing that than other kinds of interventions. And to me, I think we actually still don't know that. I felt like we got a very clear picture in your book of what these organizations say they are trying to do and want to do. What we don't get a picture of is what the impact of that work has been on the beneficiaries. And I'm guessing that that is because you're a very careful scholar and you are very well aware, and you refer to this in the text, of the incredible difficulty and challenge of measuring the effectiveness of democracy aid programs, for example, and other kinds of development aid as well. And so I think you're very careful not to tell the reader that you're looking at the impact, and you word things very carefully about what these organizations are trying to do, attempting to do. But the reader is left with the question of what was the impact of all of this? And do we actually know, what evidence do we have that this kind of democracy assistance was more effective at inculcating democratic values and democratic practices and democratic awareness and rights claiming and the other thing that you mentioned among Egyptians than other programs? I'm willing to believe that there might be a case to be made that that's very true, but we don't get the evidence for that in your book. And indeed, I think, this points to sort of a larger challenge in the democracy aid field writ large, of which you're very well aware, is that the question of impact is something that is a real challenge. There's a real lack, at least when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, really solid, deep longitudinal studies looking at the impact of external assistance on NGOs, on institutions, on groups, on movements. And so if I were a US policymaker looking at trying to decide where to invest funds, I would want to ask, how do we know that this is going to be more effective? And then one of the challenges of this whole enterprise is that we don't really know. There's some anecdotal evidence, but we don't have much more than that across the board. And that's something that I think is a real challenge that should be recognized, is what we don't know about impact. Two final points. One is, I wonder if, I think Egypt is a very good case study for looking at US kind of democracy aid and the failures of it. We could say, but I'm not sure that the Egypt case study provides enough to be generalizable to a lot of other settings. And that's because of the US relationship with Egypt. US government funded democracy assistance in Egypt is entirely derivative of that strategic relationship. It is not based on a top-level desire to promote democracy in Egypt and the US government, save for a very brief time in 2011 and 2012, which is the main focus of your research, incidentally, when there actually was more of a high-level interest, although still quite ambivalent. But there was more interest among high-level U.S. government policymakers in promoting democratic change in Egypt than there ever was before or since. But generally speaking, the U.S. democracy to Egypt is provided because, not because of a demand in Egypt, and it's not responding to conditions on the ground in Egypt. It's responding to political imperatives, basically, in Washington that have to do with, you know, what Congress wants and what some people in the U.S. bureaucracy want to do. And so what you really have in Egypt is a pot of money that U.S. policymakers and aid officials need to decide how to spend. And then, in addition to that, what gets funded is then filtered through all of these other rubrics to end up with sort of this lowest common denominator approach. Because of the strategic and security imperatives that drive our relationship with Egypt, because of the U.S. government high policy relationship with the Egyptian government, the U.S. has been trying at certain points, not consistently, but to provide democracy aid on the ground level, but then not necessarily engage with the Egyptian government at the highest levels about their lack of democratic behavior. So you end up, in the case of Egypt in particular, and Jordan I would say is similar, any place where you have the aid being provided for because of a strategic relationship, not because of conditions on the ground or actual U.S. policy goal of promoting democracy, you get this kind of distortion of what the aid would be. So to me, the question of how much we could take some of your observations and recommendations having to do with the U.S. role and apply it to other contexts, I think might be somewhat limited for those reasons because of the particularity of this U.S.-Egypt relationship. And indeed, someone who's been working in this field as a practitioner, working on democracy aid programs in the Middle East on the ground with U.S. and Arab NGOs, as a scholar studying this work in the U.S. government, I have now come to the point where I actually think the U.S., and I'm on record writing this, should just stop providing democracy aid to Egypt right now. I don't think it can be useful. And I don't think we can achieve anything that's that meaningful. I think our resources are better put into other areas and supporting socioeconomic development and other things that would be more valued by the Egyptian government and more able to have an impact. So I actually think personally, the point I'm at right now and sort of my journey of looking at all of this is that I think the US should get out of this business in Egypt for the time being, because we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And there's so many constraints around what we can do imposed by our own policy, imposed by the Egyptian government, that what we're going to end up with is far less innovative than the very interesting recommendations that you have, which I read with great interest and I wish could be implemented, but I'm not sure that the US aid bureaucracy and the US-Egypt relationship at this time would be sort of capable or desirous of making the kind of significant changes to the aid program that you recommend.
Well, thank you, Amy, very much. And thank everybody. You know, normally I'd go back to the author and say, what do you think? But, you know, in a Zoom world, I feel like we want to draw people in a little more. I don't even know what the word normally means anymore, but that's its own discussion. So I think what I'm going to do is start with some of the questions that have come in, and I will come back. And some of you, Katie, are related to the questions. You may build it into your answers, but I'll come back again for anything else you want to say in response to Stephen Amy said. And as the questions come in, all panelists should feel free. I'll start with Katie, but if either of you have things to say about them, please do as well. So one of the questions, actually from my colleague at Duke, Professor Magrury, is saying that another criticism, additional ones that you mentioned, Katie, U.S. democracy promotion in MENA, is that U.S. standing in the region and overall U.S. standing in the region and its inconsistent commitment to democracy promotion, which is partly what I think both Amy and Stephen were saying. And let me just sort of piggyback on that. I mean, when I think about this more broadly and ask the question, when there's been a tension and a choice between geostrategic interests and democracy promotion, maybe human rights as well, you know, what's really been the overall pattern of U.S. foreign policy? When you go back to the first half of the 20th century in Latin America, pretty obvious. you know, Wilsonianism was not exactly very Wilsonian in its roles in Latin America. If you look at the Cold War and the distinction between when we, you know, supported Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, because it was consistent with our geostrategic interests, and all the other ways which we did, whether it was Franco in Spain and, you know, et cetera, you know, and so in some respects, it may make your work more relevant, which is a little bit, I think, what both Stephen and Amy were saying too. You know, stay below the radar, you can work with local groups and maybe have some impact, even though we have trouble measuring it. But this question of America standing for democracy, you know, granted that the Trump version has been a rather extreme version, but separate from that, I always feel so much of our analysis has to be not just, you know, what Trump has done, but what were the issues that faced us before him and will face him after him. How do you feel about what you know, Professor McGrory was asking, and generally about could we improve these policies if our general standing in the region was as it has been?
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists. I hope that I can address all of your excellent points and weave those into my responses to the Q&A. If not, I will come back to you offline afterwards because your comments were just so helpful and insightful. So thank you. The current question raises two questions in my mind. First, I want to go back to Stephen's question. Does the U.S. why is there a need to promote democracy? Why does the U.S. need a democracy promotion agenda? What's the rationale? And the question that's raised in my mind is, does the U.S., and Amy brought this up to a point, does the U.S. want democracy in the first place? Is the U.S. afraid of grassroots democracy, a grassroots democratic revolution? And so related to that is, in my mind anyway, is the question of what is the, as the question asks, what is the U.S. standing in the region? And a number of analysts have actually written on this. And Stephen, I welcome your comments as well, because I believe you had an FP piece about this. I think it absolutely raises real questions in my mind. I don't know that I have the answer to that. But what it raises in my mind is can we be thinking not only about promoting democracy abroad, but how do we think about shoring up democracy in the United States? Can we draw similarities between what we've seen in grassroots mobilization and citizen mobilization, not just within the NGOs, often outside of the NGOs. We know that in the uprisings themselves, for example, NGOs were not present. But what can we learn from citizen mobilizations in Egypt, in Hong Kong, in Turkey, in Canada? What can we learn from citizen mobilization and citizen solidarity that we've also been seeing in some of the movements here, particularly the recent Black Lives Matter movement, what can we learn from these citizen mobilizations and solidarity to shore up our own democracy and perhaps have more standing if, to Stephen's point, we actually, and Amy's point, we actually do want to promote democracy in the first place. Stephen and Amy, again, Stephen, I think that you have written on this. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have a couple of general comments on this. First, I think something that Amy alluded to and that Bruce then picked up the strand is the importance of looking at the strategic relationship that the United States has with Egypt and how it is arranged. So if you go back and you look at the aid relationship, whether it's the military aid relationship or the economic aid relationship, what was the U.S. goal? The U.S. goal was to anchor the Egyptian regime and ensure that it is stable without any regard to the character of that regime, because that regime would be at peace with Israel, would be a moderate force in the region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is, by the way, why our military aid has been geared towards making sure the Egyptians actually can't fight in the Sinai Peninsula, which we're seeing that right now. So it's very hard to take a relationship that we've had in the way that we've had it and then inject this question of democracy in it, because that's not the underlying rationale of the relationship with Egypt. And you can see, and it's exactly what it say, it's fitting, what did you say? Square peg and round hole and square peg, whatever it is. What Amy said on this issue. We've done democracy promotion in places where it has served our strategic interests. Eastern and Central Europe, we promoted democratic change. We did a lot of things there, and we meant it. I don't think we meant it in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and in Palestine and all of these other places. So I think that that's a problem. I get to the point of, do we need a democracy promotion program, for two reasons. One, what you described and what I thought was a very compelling narrative about local NGOs that may be, let me underline that, may be effective. And second, I don't see a fundamental shift in the way in which the US government and the way in which people who make policy, including people on Capitol Hill, view the world. And that is to say, yeah, I think people really are afraid of democracy. Look, I've gone before committees on Capitol Hill and had people tell me that Sisi is the greatest ally that the United States has ever had because he saved us from the caliphate with, straight faces. So I believe that we actually are, and I wonder whether it's worthwhile. And quite honestly, this is an argument that Amy and I have had over and over again, is does the kinds of things that we've talked about, conditioning aid, does it make these countries less unstable and more democratic? And I don't think that that's the case. Anyway, on this question of can we do this now in particular, setting aside the fact that we were never really serious about it, I think we're more impaired now than we ever have been before. And Katie, you're referring to a piece that I did for Foreign Policy saying, yes, Lafayette Square is Tahrir Square. Now, of course, there's huge differences. The point that I was making is that the demands that ultimately, when you roll all this stuff up, the demands that people were making were about dignity. And that if large portions of the American public don't feel that they live in a situation of dignity where they have legal recourse, where we talk about the justice system, but the justice system only returns injustice for them, then add all of the kinds of horrific Middle Eastern-esque type things that you saw in Lafayette Square, like militarized police beating the crap out of foreign journalists and the total disregard for human rights and the use of force. I don't know how we waltz into the Egyptian foreign ministry and say, you guys need to be better, because everybody can see that we're not. I think that it's one of these things that we have to get our house in order first before we can even think about it. And then even then, it's a question of whether we can actually do this.
Great. Amy.
Sure. Well, I mean, given my job and the organization where I work, I do think the U.S. needs a democracy promotion policy in the Middle East. I believe that the legacy of U.S. policy in the Middle East for the last 40, 45 years has been extremely negative for the region. And that the U.S. we didn't create authoritarianism in the Middle East, certainly not. It was there before the United States became the hegemonic power, and it will be there after. But through, trillions of dollars spent and various forms of diplomatic and security engagement, I would say that on balance, we can look at U.S. policy in the Middle East and say that our main legacy is aiding and abetting the continuance of authoritarianism. And I think that has been entirely negative for the people of the region. And in some ways, I think it's been negative for U.S. policy as well. So I'm someone who thinks that we need to rethink our entire approach to the region. But of course, I'm an outlier. Otherwise, U.S. policy toward the Middle East would look different than it does. I do want to make a point, drawing on something that Egypt said, that Stephen just said, and going back to my point to Katie earlier about the choice of Egypt as the case study, or Egypt as the sort of focus of your book. I think there are cases in authoritarian regimes where the U.S. has a friendly, not adversarial relationship with that authoritarian regime, where the U.S. has a little more leeway, a little more room to do more interesting, more flexible, more experimental, probably more effective democracy assistance. I don't think that Egypt is one of those cases. I think that one of the main things that we learned after 2011 about the U.S.-Egypt relationship was that once Hosni Mubarak was gone from the scene, the imperative of exhibiting nationalism and pushing back against things that the U.S. was trying to do in Egypt that people inside the Egyptian regime didn't like. After Mubarak was gone from the scene, those imperatives, that became an imperative on the Egyptian side of the relationship for understandable reasons. And what we learned is that when the Egyptian regime said, we don't want you to do these programs, the United States, still the world's most powerful country, the major bankroller and backer of the Egyptian military in the world, blinked and said, okay, sorry, we don't want, we're going to back down. And so what we learned is that the U.S. Will ultimately, when the Egyptian government objects to these programs, the U.S. doesn't have the kind of relationship with Egypt in which it will stand up and say, no, this is what we want to promote, this is what we're doing. Now, whether that's the right course of action is a separate discussion. I think there are other cases, other countries where the host country government maybe isn't so obstinate about where U.S. aid funds are going, or where maybe the environment is a little more hospitable, or where the regime isn't so focused on what foreign funds are doing in the program, where there might be the kind of space on the ground level for interesting things to happen that the regime in power isn't necessarily aware of or isn't fully cognizant of what's going on, and therefore you have real sort of change happening without obstruction from the regime. But I just don't think that Egypt is that place. And as I said, I'm sorry to sound so skeptical, but I have come out in a very skeptical place about U.S. assistance to Egypt, and particularly U.S. democracy aid to Egypt at this juncture in the U.S.-Egypt relationship. I just don't think it's possible for the U.S. to do really anything meaningful on that front. And I think our goal should be do no harm. So I actually think we should get out of the business of doing things that could be harmful to grantees or otherwise, and just focus on things that we feel pretty sure will have a benefit and not get people, Americans or Egyptians, in trouble. And I think that means staying away from anything to do with democracy until circumstances change, or until we have a different U.S. policy where the imperative is actually to go toe-to-toe with the Egyptian regime and promote these values and stand up for these programs. But that's not what the U.S.-Egypt relationship looks like. And this was under Obama, of course. It's not a product of Trump. This was a situation under Obama.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Let me pass another question. This one starts with my colleague and Bridging the Gap co-director, Professor Jordan Tama of American University. We got to part of it, but let me pose it and then add on a piece. He's asking, to what extent should the weaknesses in the character and quality of U.S. democracy today affect how, or to the extent to which, we promote democracy and participation in other countries? So let's, for the sake of discussion, imagine or whatever that there is a Biden administration in 2021. And it comes in, and two aspects of this. One is, waltzes into the foreign ministry in Egypt and elsewhere and says, we're back, we care about these things. So one question is, the waiting you out question, right? I mean, if you think of American politics as sort of the equivalent of like a currency, we like to keep currency fluctuations within an equilibrium zone. And you look at the last 20 years of American politics, right? 2 efforts to impeach presidents, presidential election 2000 that had to be refereed by the Supreme Court, 2003 war that we went to that most of the world didn't want. We then go to one extreme, we elect an African-American president, which many in the world like, but we're surprised by. Then we go to the other extreme and elect, a reality TV star. And so they say, why should I think, whether 2024 or your midterm elections or whatever, that you're going to stay in that currency fluctuation political equilibrium zone. And not just Egypt, but a number of countries, including countries that we're not just leveraging to do some things they don't want to do, but are looking to us for support. The other part of it that really intrigues me, and it came out of what, a part of what all you have done in your careers and your book, Katie, is I get it that we don't want, we're not going to transplant American institutions, even if they're doing really well, to other cultures. But what does it look like when we say we believe that other cultures can achieve their form of different forms that are, have democratic values in it? What are some of the things that would tell us that that's happening and that it's not? How do we think about that without being culturally imperialist or sort of culture, in either way of the term, that you can't do what we did because you're not as good as us, or our way's the right way? I mean, that's a bundle of things. So just pick off some things that relate to what we think about democracy and what we're trying to do out there in the world, assuming we try in any respect.
Thank you, Jordan. On the question of currency and, is it, let's say we do have a Biden administration and we say, okay, we're back and we are full-throatedly behind democracy. I think a big question for the United States, to my mind, is to what extent can we reshore up allies? And present a counterweight to the model that the Chinese are putting forward, for example, and draw on allies to bolster our own commitment, and by going to allies show, okay, we truly are back and we are rebuilding these alliances, and we as a group, not just the United States, but we as a group are committed long-term to the pursuit of freedom, justice, and equality in a global society. And the question of, okay, well, what about indicators of success? What does that look like? And I want to go back and just address the point that Amy made, and she's absolutely right, that I don't take up the question of impact at that NGO level, and I know this is the micro level now, but I don't take up that more specific question of NGO impact on democratization in Egypt, in part because, as she pointed out, it's far too early to predict. What is it that someone asked, well, what is the impact of the French Revolution? And this was sometime in the past 50 years. And the response was, well, we don't know yet. So now I'm not going to go that extreme, but it raises the question of, okay, how do we think about measuring success, and what are the indicators, and who decides what the indicators are? I've stressed certain values, and Stephen mentioned human dignity, and I really think that we need to raise the profile of that particular idea, but we really need to my mind, and from what I've been hearing in my work in Egypt and now Palestine, is listen to those on the ground and understand their conceptualizations of what does, quote unquote, democracy mean, and how might we imagine, what might we imagine indicators to be, whether those are at grassroots levels, whether those are at national political institutional levels. What does a democratic social contract look like? And my suggestion is that the US should not presume to know the answer to that, but to really work with citizens around the world. So I'll stop there and ask what our panelists think.
Okay, Amy, why don't we come to you and then we'll go to Stephen.
So I guess if I understood the main question correctly, if I would rephrase it as, does the US have to be a strongly functioning, strong, solid, perfect democracy to promote democracy overseas? I think the answer is no. I think there's a bit of a caricature of US democracy promotion. In some cases that it involves kind of trying to export or implant US systems and practices. And in my nearly 25 years of working in this field, I think I could count on like 2 fingers the times that I've actually seen something like that happening. I think this is one area where writ large, US democracy promotion has evolved and improved a lot. Most of the people working on these programs as practitioners are more aware of the dysfunction of US democracy and of their own democracy, no matter, if they don't come from the US. And many of the people working in these programs are actually not American. They come from new democracies and emerging democracies. I think there's very little that I've observed, at least, of programs that are designed to sort of replicate what we have here in the United States. That doesn't mean that doesn't happen, but I think by and large, the approach has become more sophisticated. So the idea that we're trying to transplant something that isn't functioning here, I don't think is necessarily the challenge. I don't think that that's what is going on in these programs. I've noticed something really interesting in the working level since Trump was elected, and the crisis of our own democracy has really come to the fore. Problems that were brewing before Trump was elected have come out, to emerge fully for us to really grapple with, and have become more acute, more serious in the past 3.5 years. People who work on the transnational promotion of democracy and human rights, I think there's a feeling of even greater solidarity between Americans who are doing this work and people in other countries that are imperfect democracies, emerging democracies, or authoritarian regimes. In the case of Egypt, I think there's even more sensitivity and sort of awareness of the challenges and the fragility of creating democracy in our own country or in anyone's country and keeping it going. I do think, though, that there is something to be said for kind of the standing of the United States in the world writ large. When that seems to be weakened, as I believe it currently is, I think that does, it's not an unsurmountable obstacle for on-the-ground programs, but it definitely creates an environment, creates an atmosphere in which everything that the U.S. is trying to do in all fields is somehow tarnished or diminished. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. I think that people who are implementing these aid programs on the ground, in many cases, do a really good job of making clear that they're not part of the U.S. government, that they're working with U.S. government money, they're advancing U.S. policy writ large, but that they're separate from Washington. But I think that yeah, I guess I'll just stop there. I think that this crisis of democracy in our own country has caused a lot of democracy promotion practitioners to reflect a lot more deeply on what they're engaged in and how it connects to what's happening in our own country. And as I said, I do think that the sort of moral crisis, if we could call it that, as about the U.S. role in the world writ large and our standing in the world writ large, does diminish our soft power and diminishes our effectiveness across the board to support these kinds of things.
Right. Stephen.
Let me just pick up quickly on Amy's last point, and then I'll address Bruce's question directly. First, I agree with Amy. I've never heard of anybody who thought we could like pick up one system and drop it down in somewhere else. I think it's maybe in the craziest moments in the run up to the war of Iraq did I hear that. But I think that we're probably talking the same people. Anyway,
that's true. That's an important.
I think, and I think Amy's right that, at that working level, the people who are implementing programs have been more soul searching about it. I mean, myself, in spending time in the region, it's a humbling moment to be an American in the Middle East. The reason why I think that our ability to promote more open and democratic societies in the region is impaired by what's gone on is not because people who are doing these programs aren't, rethinking, not because they're not well-meaning, not because these things may, we can debate their value, but that leaders in the region and opponents of this can use this in their own project to undermine those in those countries who want to take up these things. So, you see this across the region where things that happen in the United States, and it's not just what's happened recently, that have been used by regimes and their supporters to undermine American efforts there, that are then painted as neo-colonial projects, the new white man's burden, which is actually a difficult issue to wrestle with. It is a very, very hard one when you're trying to accomplish these things. But I want to get to Bruce's question, because I have a sneaky way of answering it. If the former vice president is elected, I actually don't think we're going to walk into ministries of foreign affairs and say, we're back and we really care about these things. I don't detect that the former vice president himself has any particular commitment to the idea of promoting democracy in regions where it's hard to do, where people aren't receptive to it, where we have, importantly, critical, at least the way in which we tell ourselves, critical strategic interests. In addition to the fact, let's say that happens, and Amy is dispatched to Cairo and she says, we're back, or name your foreign ministry, and Amy comes in and says, hey, we're back in democracy, and so on and so forth. I think, people will say, would you like another glass of tea? Because we're pretty sure 4 years from now, you'll swing another 180 degrees in the other direction. Plus, you're a bunch of incompetent rubes. Plus, you've been tear gassing your own people. Plus, the Patriot Act. Plus, Abu Ghraib. Plus, Palestine. Plus. All those things. Sorry, we don't believe you. And by the way, remember, Amy, when you were living in Cairo in the 1990s, and we would talk about China? Well, now China is actually a real option for us. Whether it really is or isn't, they believe it. And what the strategic goal for many Egyptian policymakers, at least in my conversations, are, is to, one, tell Americans, don't force us to choose between you and your largesse and China, where we think our future is, and to try, in a crazy way, because China is different from Egypt, to emulate China, which is to have spectacular economic growth without ever having to loosen the reins on authoritarian reins. Now, I think that's a terrible misreading on the part of Egyptian officials on what's going on in China. But nevertheless, they believe that. So I think that they would sit back, they'd be very polite, and say, okay, Amy, that's cool. We weathered the freedom agenda. We weathered the Arab Spring. That's what I think will happen.
This is great. We're going to run out of time soon and have all sorts of things we want to talk about. So we've got...
I'm just getting warmed up.
I know. And we've got about 5 minutes. So I've got two very similar questions and one different. I'm going to combine them. One is from Christina Biad, who used to work with us at Bridging the Gap and is now working for a very interesting program called Foreign Policy for America that I can't say any more about it other than encourage you to look at it, otherwise it'll become a political commercial, but hey, Christina. And the other from an anonymous attendee. And they're both trying to get at the question that your book really focuses on, Katie, about, how much the Egyptian government monitors, grassroots movements and NGOs, and is this deterring citizens from doing that? And then the follow-on question from an anonymous attendee is whether our democratization is aiding and polarizing the Egyptian civil society scene. So that's one little basket real quick. The other is another question that asks, and this can maybe be answered in one word by everybody, which authoritarian countries or country in the region do you think are more open to democracy programming? That may be none, and maybe a particular country. But maybe if we can go around one last time and address those, that would be great.
Great, thank you. Christina and our anonymous questioner, regarding the monitoring and the polarization. So I think we're now on Law 149 of 2019 for regulating NGOs. We had Law 84 of 2002 that lasted until around 2017 when we had Law 70, and now we're on 149. And all of these NGO laws, despite their iterations, allow the government to excessively monitor and control NGOs. Everything from the registration phase to overseeing activities that organizations conduct, banning any activities that could be deemed political or threats to national security, broadly defined, allowing for arbitrary enforcement. Restrictions on fundraising, particularly on foreign funds, and we've seen around the world restrictions on foreign funding. The government can monitor board meetings, you name it, and dissolve organizations for disobeying the law, fine and imprison their employees. So does this restrict the types of, even if we're saying surreptitious democracy promotion work? You know, it's a delicate dance. Okay, one organization I'll never forget visited this organization a number of times. It had children's artwork around the office, and the director explained, look, this artwork, it serves, we have art classes, it serves as revenue generation. It also serves to distract the government. We point to these activities and not the mobilization that we're doing, not what we're doing with art. We're painting sailboats and flowers. And so organizations they grumbled regularly about the monitoring. They're pretty savvy about evading it. But yeah, Big Brother was always watching, and that's enshrined into law. In terms of the polarization, I think, yeah, what I saw on the ground was that democracy aid really did further polarize, but that polarization between the sort of democracy promotion group of NGOs and then the development NGOs, and even separately the charitable NGOs, that polarization was entrenched long before the uprisings and just exacerbated afterwards, in part because these different organizations were competing for funding and legitimacy. So yeah, I think that the funding did play into that mobilization. Others?
And do you just want to quickly name a country, or the answer may be none, that you think is open to democracy programming in the region?
I think there are certain countries where support for NGOs under the rubric of socioeconomic development that have democracy goals and activities woven into them is possible to do in certain countries in the region. I'm not going to name them though, because then their governments will start paying closer attention. I think there are some more relatively permissible environments for certain kinds of things that Katie's talking about in some authoritarian era countries. And I just wanted to say again, before I hand things over to Stephen and to you, Bruce, for closing, that I really want to again congratulate Katie on this book. I read a lot of books on Egypt, on US democracy promotion, on democratization, and this is one of the most sort of thought-provoking and I think sophisticated that I've read in a long time. I would really encourage everyone to read it. It's very worth reading, and it'll raise a lot of questions that I think we all really need to grapple with. So congratulations again, Katie, great achievement.
Stephen.
I started speaking before I unmuted. Story of my life. Look, I think on this question of polarization, one of the things that I thought was just was so interesting about Delta Democracy was how Katie highlighted how NGOs and foundations that are working on socioeconomic issues can pursue a democracy agenda. And I think, and that is a way of, as I said, nestling this work in a broader effort that may be more effective. And one can understand how this accentuates the existing polarization among different organizations that are pursuing agendas that may overlap or don't overlap, but they may be competing for scarce resources, which is, I think, problematic overall because it undermines a lot of the work that it seems to me undermine a lot of the work that's being done because of the herding cats nature of the NGO sector. I don't know if there's anything that anybody can do about that. It's just the nature of things. In terms of naming a country in the region that is more accepting of this kind of thing, well, it really, it's a question, is it they accept it, that they want to do this, or that it is a way, once again, for regimes to kind of protect themselves from criticism, so that they take on board some of these projects, and then they look at US officials or members of Congress on a CODEL who are beating them up and stuff and say, well, look at all this, we have democracy aid, look at what we're doing. I don't think that there's a, the joke is, that the Jordanians and the Moroccans have been very good at perfecting grants for democracy promotion without ever having to do anything, undertake real change. I think one of the things that we should learn coming out of the Arab Spring is that the country that really has made the most progress and is really, kind of extraordinary. And I was, as I'm cynical about everything, I was cynical about Tunisia. But really the place where it seems to me these things are more welcome is in a place that's already had significant change. One that I'm skeptical about the diffusion argument, because Tunisia is a small little place that has long been an outlier. But I think it's important to recognize that, none of these places may be receptive to this stuff until they've actually begun a genuine transition. End of story.
Well, this is.
Oh, and I just want to think, Katie, the book's great.
Yeah. So on that note, Katie, do you have a copy of the book you can hold up for everybody to see?
I do.
I do.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
There's my blurb.
Yeah, and the blurb. And people ask where they could buy it. Amazon, obviously, Oxford University Press directly, or if you're trying to support your local bookstore, you can probably order it through them as well. So.
And I have a 30% discount for Oxford University Press. Please consider supporting either your local bookstore or university presses and ordering directly through Oxford. I can give you that 30% discount code.
Thank you all. Thanks to Stephen and Amy for being with us, your expertise, and to you, Katie, and congratulations. And thank you to all of the participants. Folks have really gotten some good questions, good comments, and have stayed with us for most of the session. So best wishes to all. And thanks again. Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.